All right, let's recap our headlines now this hour. 2 Al Jazeera journalists have been injured by shrapnel from an Israeli missile strike in Gaza. One is waiting for paramedics to reach him amid intense shelling in Khan Yunis. At least 12 people have been killed by Israeli bombardment in the north and southern parts of Gaza. The White House is urging Israel to pull back on its high-intensity military operation and focus on protecting civilians. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has told the U.S. National Security Advisor Israeli attacks in Gaza and the West Bank must stop. Jake Sullivan is in Ramallah after meetings with Israel's Prime Minister and War Cabinet in Tel Aviv. Palestinian journalists in Gaza are not just covering the war, but they're living through it too. At least 89 Palestinian journalists have been killed in the conflict. More than 50 media premises or offices have been completely or partially destroyed by Israeli strikes. That includes the office of the AFP news agency's bureau in Gaza. Hundreds of Palestinian journalists and their families, including those from Al Jazeera, have been forcibly displaced. They had to abandon their reporting equipment in offices in the north to live and report under difficult conditions during frequent communication blackouts. Journalists working in areas of armed conflict are protected under international humanitarian law, as are civilians under the Geneva Convention. But Israel is accused of repeatedly violating the rules of law. Palestinian journalists say Israel is trying to kill the messenger and silence the story. Jonathan Duggar is the head of the Middle East desk with Reporters Without Borders, joins us now live from Paris. Good to have you with us, sir. First of all, let me ask you for your reaction to the wounding of 2 of our colleagues in Gaza.
Good evening. We strongly denounce another Israeli attack against Palestinian journalists, against Al Jazeera journalist correspondents Wael al-Dahdouh and Samer Abu Dakka. We hope for a very speedy and full recovery for Wael al-Dahdouh, and we're very worried about Samer Abu Dakka. We call upon urgently on the Israeli army to allow aid to enter and to get to Samer Abu Dakka, who is in urgent need of help. And we hope this message comes through your channel. This is an unacceptable attack against brave journalists who are covering the conflict in Khan Yunis. Wael al-Dahdouh has already lost family members in an earlier Israeli strike in the south of Gaza in October, and today he is paying the price for doing his work. This is, of course, in the wider context of Israeli attacks against journalists. There are at least 64 journalists who have been killed since the beginning of this war, 13 of whom were killed for reasons related directly to their work. We call on the protection of journalists. We call upon Israeli and Egyptian authorities to open the Rafah gate so that journalists can leave if they need to, and that international journalists can come in to work alongside them.
How disturbing is it when you get initial reports from people on the ground are talking about a drone being responsible? This is a drone strike. And we know, of course, drones are advanced weapons, more precision weapons. How much more disturbing does it make it?
We're extremely concerned about these allegations. We're obviously looking into them. There are a lot of very concerning circumstances around this latest attack, namely that Wael had already lost family members. There are already tensions with the Al Jazeera crew. As you said, these could be precision weapons. We will definitely investigate whether this was a targeted attack, and we remind very strongly that targeting journalists covering a war is a war crime, according to the Geneva Conventions, according to the Rome Statute governing the International Criminal Court. RSF has already submitted a complaint to the International Criminal Court asking to investigate the killing of journalists and in order to find out if there was intentional targeting, and therefore if there were war crimes committed.
Do you think it's time for Israeli officials to change their tune when it comes to the sanctity of life in Gaza? We heard on October the 13th of this year from the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, saying, quote, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true." We've heard a few times from Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, talk about referencing verses from the Bible on the destruction, the injunction to destroy Amalek, verses which talk about destroying civilian life, women, children, babies, even animals. Is it time for a change in rhetoric, and a rhetoric that underscores the sanctity of civilian life, including journalists?
I wouldn't just say it's time. I would say it's long overdue. We've heard very alarming statements on behalf of Israeli authorities, who on the one hand say that they do not explicitly target journalists, and on the other hand they imply this complicity on behalf of journalists. They accuse some journalists of working with Hamas, which would imply a justification for killing journalists in this war between Israel and Hamas. We've heard some statements directly calling for the punishment of Palestinian journalists in Gaza coming from Israeli politicians, calls that were made based on disinformation campaigns accusing these journalists of working with Hamas. It is very important to say that these journalists are covering the war on the ground. They are doing a very brave job in extremely difficult circumstances. They are our first line of defense against disinformation. Long before the start of the war, these journalists were also facing pressures from Hamas. They are not in any way friendly with the group. These calls are extremely denounced, and they are extremely worrying as well, and they are an extra element that we consider when wondering whether, when investigating whether there has been intentional targeting of journalists.
Okay, thank you so much for your thoughts and your comments on that. Well, let's bring in now Yusuf Bouandel. He's a professor of political science and international relations at Qatar University. Good to have you with us, sir. So we've got these scenes of more civilian casualties, including our own colleagues, journalists, once again falling victims in this Israeli attack on Gaza. This is coming at the same time as you have Jake Sullivan talking about the necessity to protect civilian life. Kind of undermines that message, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and obviously over the last week or so, there has been a wide gap between what the rhetoric that comes from Washington and the responses from Netanyahu. Netanyahu basically is on a relentless drive to eradicate Hamas and to eradicate the civilian population. There are two kinds of war going on at the moment. The one which is where Israel is using those weapons and so on and so forth. But there is also another war on the airwaves. And Israel wants basically to silence any other narrative that contradicts what comes out of its news channels, and Al Jazeera has been a key player in that. Let's not forget that Shireen Abu Akleh, for instance, was killed by an Israeli sniper not long ago. And this, what happened to Wa'il al-Dahdouh, is another testimony to Israel's relentless drive to silence any dissident voice.
When we look at the US message now, do you see that it's evolving into a call for Israel to just reduce the intensity of the attacks? What does that mean?
Obviously, over the last 4 weeks or so, there has been a shift in US attitudes towards Israel. It began with the green light to do whatever you like, and after that it went to proceed with caution. You need to pay attention to international law and so on and so forth, and you need to protect civilians. So the message from Washington is getting a little bit tougher, but not tough enough to prevent Netanyahu and his most extreme right-wing government to do what they want to do. I believe that Netanyahu is fighting for his political survival. He wants to inflict as much damage as possible to show his own people that he was doing the right thing to protect Israel and to ensure that Hamas no longer poses a threat.
So does this, Yusuf, does this mean for those who were expecting or hoping that maybe the visit by Jake Sullivan to the region would produce some kind of timeline, some expiry date on this operation, that they're going to be disappointed? We're not going to get that.
Well, I think they will be disappointed. If anything, it will come from within Israel, because over the last week or so, or 2 weeks, we have seen that Netanyahu in particular has not been paying attention to whatever is coming out from the outside world. So if there is any pressure on Netanyahu and his government to do something, I believe it would come
But
from
the US
inside.
does have huge leverage, though, here, right? Provides a lot of aid, a lot of military hardware to Israel. If the US wanted to take the sort of stance that historically we've seen US presidents sometimes take, Joe Biden would be able to do that.
Now, of course, he would be. I mean, on the show last week, was asked this kind of question, and I said that if there was a discussion in the Security Council at this stage, the United States would veto it. And a few days later, we all know what happened. So the US has the potential to bring to an end this carnage that is happening in Gaza. But the will of Biden and his government to do it remains a big question.
We're also seeing a gathering of Arab foreign ministers and European foreign ministers going on in Oslo, including, I should say, also the Turkish foreign minister. Is some kind of proposal, vision coming out for how to end this and what the post-Gaza or post-war scenario looks like?
That's very difficult to predict. Obviously, politics is the art of possible, so everything is possible. There has been moves to put some sort of plans into practice. We hear from the representatives of Hamas, for instance, they're saying there will be no future or any discussion of the future of Hamas, of Gaza without Hamas is wishful thinking. The Israelis are saying we're not going to stop until we eradicate Hamas. So the stakes are very high. The rhetoric from both parties is very, very high. But I do believe that some kind of avenue or some kind of solution or proposal may be found to be discussed.
All right. Thank you so much, Yusuf Boandel.
Thank you.